Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this seminar organized by the Arun Duggal Centre for ESG at IIM Ahmedabad. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Modak to give his talk on ESG being a greenwash or a value proposition. Dr. Modak is an accomplished practitioner as well as an academician in the domain of ESG. And if I'm going to talk about each of his accomplishments as an academician and a practitioner, it's going to take up the entire 1 hour. So I'll just briefly name some of the famous agencies that he has worked with in this domain. So he has worked with the UN, World Bank, IFC, Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, among many other agencies in this domain of ESG. So again, a very warm welcome to Dr. Modak, and I'll hand off the reins of this webinar to Dr. Modak to start his talk. Now, for all the attendees, if you have any questions for the first 45 minutes while Dr. Modak is talking about his issues, please type them in the chat window, and I will make sure that the comments are passed on to the speaker. Once we open up the webinar, you are welcome to come up with any impromptu comments after the first 45 minutes. Okay, so that is how we are going to run this webinar. Right, so we can start now.
Thank you so much, Naman, and great pleasure to be today. And Arun, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this very interesting subject on environmental and social and governance. I'm going to run through some slides. And of course, like Naman said, put your questions as we go along. But if you really feel that you should interject and maybe do some comments, I think, is that okay, Naman? We can even let people who want to.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. But since this is webinar mode, it will still have to be typed into the chat window. So,
I got you.
Yes, I'll moderate those comments. Don't worry.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So let me start sharing my screen, and Naman, let me know whether it is showing up.
Yes, we can see everything.
All right. So, friends, today I'm not going to be giving an answer to this question, definitely not. But certainly, many of us today, when we hear about this term ESG, question comes in our mind that is it just a greenwash, or could this be potentially a value proposition? I'm going to put in this presentation both these perspectives and then leave it to you at the end to decide which way you see ESG as a strategy or as a framework would be used. Obviously, that it serves more as a value proposition. So let's move on. The whole interest, if you look at in the subject, I would attribute much more to the investors, not so much to the regulators, but more towards the investors. And investing in ESG, if you look at this slide, shows that there's a pretty large size of the asset. The asset book we're talking like close to 30 trillion is substantial, where we see subject of ESG has been influencing when investment decisions are being taken. And then a recent study done by the Capital Group is telling us that more than 1,000 global investors today, out of which 89%, close to 90%, adopted ESG as their investment strategy a little while ago, 2022 statistics. And the issue is not that there is now more and more traction in terms of people want to know about it. There is an awareness obviously happening not at the investors' end alone, but also the companies, the investee companies. But I think the question is that how do we use this ESG framework to the advantage, and how to part? I think it's still a mute question. Then how does one really bring in these ESG elements in the overall company strategy? When I say company, it would mean both the investors as well as the investee companies. But then that takes us to the fundamental question, what is this all about? What is ESG? And and if you look at the formal definition, that environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, are those set of criteria and standards operated through a management system. So this is something which is not certainly ad hoc or happens once in a while, but it has to be a continuous process where there is a use made of a management system, and this is a set of criteria and standards. And if you looked at the each of those three criteria, the environmental, social, and the governance, what we would see that the environmental criteria is talking about how a company performs as a steward of nature or the natural capital. I think the term steward is important, which just tells us that we are talking about this criteria beyond compliance. The social criteria, if you look at it, is how the organization is managing the relationships with the stakeholders. And I think this is important because we are now talking here about relationships, but not only with the shareholders, but we want to expand it to stakeholders, which can include employees, suppliers, customers, and even the communities where the business is operating. I think the governance being one of the very important element of ESG, will deal with companies' leadership, associated policies that are supported by procedures, and then executive pay, audits, accountability, internal controls, and how does one address the shareholder rights. If you put it all together, and let's see in terms of understanding it more, it appears, and everybody today knows that it is the governance which is very important in the relationship between E, S, and G. And if the governance is not strong, then we are not going to see embedding of ESG happening in the thinking of the organization, even the business processes and the strategic plans. And sometimes I could even look at ESG, where G becomes this foundation to support deliveries on both E and S criteria. And often people have realized that it is the poor governance that is the case for greenwashing. So these three, again, as I said, balance elements, out of which still G has much more importance. And one has to be very careful that greenwashing doesn't happen. And therefore, you do need a strong governance on the organization. And what is that greenwashing when we talk about the term means? And examples are, in some cases, we do see someone making broad sustainability claims without any evidence. And you see that happening, when we talk about terms eco-friendly products or sustainable services or investments without giving any specific information, and often then get refuted when asked. Another example is overstating the positive environmental effects. And then you find some qualitative statements where the products are labeled as something which are helping reduce the carbon emissions. But then you don't really, of course, validated quantitative data to support that claim. Then in some cases, the greenwashing is seen as hiding environmentally unsound practices. And this is, again, is something very important. And we have seen cases where such, I would say, the hidden unsound practices do emerge, and they can give significant reputation and financial risk. And some people are smart in terms of greenwashing because they use terminologies that could be vague and left to interpretation and can be, in fact, misleading. And that could be, in fact, intent when such a vague terminologies are being used. It is often even argued, and there's a very interesting statement which was made by a head of the SSO in research and analytics, which says that after all, what companies are trying to do is they're trying to respond to what the market wants. They want something or they want to see something, so why not just give it to them? And this kind of a loose approach of looking at short-term market response mechanisms in the business strategy can, of course, as I said, bounce and lead to several challenges for the organization. And those could be the consequences of greenwashing, what we earlier talked about. It could, of course, cause a damage to the brand reputation. It may invite regulatory action. There could be then financial losses due to even business interruption and loss of consumer or customer trust. I think all these four are so important that one who is doing any practice of greenwashing should be aware. And we have umpteen examples of organizations who have tremendously been negatively impacted because of the consequences of the greenwashing. I think most important, again, remember here, we started the story with investors, and there is another penalty, so to say, of loss of investors' confidence because of the greenwashing. It's important, therefore, that we spend a little while time now on the evolution. And this evolution, honestly, what I'm talking about is not yet very systematically documented in research. So it might be interesting for many of you who haven't gone through and experienced this evolution. And I'm a bit fortunate that I've gone through this evolution over the last 30 years, that how this subject has evolved. First, we are going to begin with how did the concept of safeguards, which came up from the Development Financing Institution, and how it led to what we are talking as the whole bucket of ESG today. And in specific, in the lending happening from the DFIs on what we call as a category FI, the finance intermediaries. Then we are going to touch
Sorry to
upon.
interject. I have one interesting question at this point.
No, Naman.
So, one attendee has asked that while ESG stands for three distinct focus areas, the climate area seems to have taken over the other two. So E has become very much more prominent compared to SNG. What are your views on this?
No, I would disagree. And I will touch upon this important question as I come later in the presentation. But certainly, if that is an impression that climate is submerged all the E and S particularly, and that's not true. And I think we'll come to that, but I will address it definitely. So thanks,
Uh,
Naman, for this moderation. As questions come, please
there's
stop.
one more hand up, Mr. Manish Shastri.
Yeah.
Manish, it would help if you could type your comment in the chat window. Okay, so that's fine. Okay, we can keep going. That's what that it was not relevant. It's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. So I was on the evolution, and I began with telling you about the end of the DFIs, which, of course, examples like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. And I think it's important that we understand the trajectory on safeguards. And I was talking about the category FI of lending, which has played a significant role in the movement on the front of ESG. We are then going to talk a bit, just a slide, but just to give you an idea how the concept is not that terribly new. And you also see there were systems which were brought by certain countries. And we're going to talk one example of proper framework in Indonesia, which was way back in 1995. And then we will talk about the private sector financing institutions, the PSFIs, and we'll pick up only some examples of frameworks like Equator Principles, IFC Performance Standard. There are several, but we'll just talk about these. And then we will reach to, again, back to the investors, the sustainable stock exchanges, and the whole idea of the reference frameworks. If you look at the term safeguards, the way it evolved, and the reason I'm doing this is because you will see slowly how the topic of ESG got evolved. And it's important that all of us, to appreciate this concept, must see what the father and the grandfather and great grandfather was there to the child ESG, what we talk today. Safeguards policies, they were looked at by the development financing institutions mainly to prevent and mitigate. And the whole idea was to do as low or less significant harm people and the environment in the development process. And then the idea was, if that was the whole idea, motive, then how do we design, identify the projects and do project management, which will in the project cycle will reduce and mitigate the negative impacts and the risk, and try to get best positive outcomes of that development process. And during that project life cycle, and I said including the closure, the safeguards were looked at as a way to address the risks at the end of life or closure of the project as well. And overall, after doing this balance between risk and opportunities, enhance the development effectiveness. And therefore, these DFIs came up with a process of applying the safeguard policies and principles and set up frameworks which in many, many ways align with the ESG frameworks we talk about today. Case of the World Bank, if you take in terms of the roots, what we saw that as the bank after the World War II began the rebuilding process, 50s and 60s and 70s, the focus was to push more and more infrastructure. And then, of course, with long-term objectives of poverty alleviation in those parts of the world where there was a significant poverty. But in the process of development, what the bank faced was several issues, like in Indonesia on the forced resettlement of millions of non-Javanese people in the Suharto regime. In India, Narmada was another controversy. Brazil, we also saw challenges when you had transport projects all the way going through the Amazon forests, causing widespread deforestation. So this was something where the civil society organizations and the media began to scrutinize banks' investments. And the bank had to come up with a response, and that response perhaps was through its safeguard policies. And that's what you see over a period of time. And just to take a snapshot of the last 5 years, you do have now environmental and social framework from 2017. And earlier there were many other variants, but now you have them in 10 elements of the framework, which cover right from the assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts, all the way to ESS 10, which is the stakeholder engagement and information disclosure. The disclosure element, what we are talking, which is so crucial in the ESG related reporting. But what is important is focus on ESS 9. We've talked about how the bank would deal with the financial intermediaries. And then basically the idea was how can the safeguard system be replicated or reflected to the intermediaries, that they would behave as if they are lending like the World Bank would do. So this is something very important, highly influencing in the financing happening from the purposes of development. And it was not just the World Bank. This was just one example I took, but all other banks also set up their own safeguard systems. Many of these DFIs, like what you see, the World Bank's 10 safeguards as an environmental social framework, IFC's performance standards, Asian Development Bank's safeguard policy statement of 2009. And now, as you know, there's a major update happening in these safeguard policies and is currently under consultation. You have EIB setting up the environmental and social standards in 2022. Remember, I'm giving you only the years of what the document stands, but the processes are ongoing for last several years in different forms. And each of the bilateral funding IDA agencies also have their own procedures for the environmental social due diligence and the performance. AIIB very recently brought out their environmental and social framework in November 2022. So there has been a long journey. So in other words, the DFIs, because they through their category FI are lending to the private sector, you're going to see obviously ripples in the private sector financing. Before we go to that private sector financing a bit, let's look at in this just one slide, example of proper the rating scheme for industries in Indonesia, which is still there. And in 1995, this program was launched. And at that time, I was advising the Ministry of Environment in Indonesia. And this particular scheme, which is looking at environmental performance of companies, was mapped into 5 color grading scale from gold to black. And in the structure itself, like what we're talking today, elements such as greenhouse gas emission reduction, conservation of natural resources, promotion of biodiversity was all looked into. And these ratings were publicly disclosed through a formal press conference. Then they also put in against the share price and also posted now on the internet. Now, this kind of an approach of rating and disclosure was a connect, which was influencing the market and the role played by the environmental. When I say environmental, social information, how it could function in developing country setting. Proper was something which is a work topic for doing research, and I think what I would propose, Professor Naman, at some stage, because you being a Center for Excellence on ESG, certainly should help, digging into such kinds of various initiatives, because Proper was echoed later on in the Philippines. It got echoed in China. We attempted to bring it in India in partnership with CII, but it didn't work that time. We chose the state of Uttar Pradesh, whether we could do something what was done in the Proper scheme. The point here is that if 1995 talked about ratings, it talked about disclosures, it talked about taking information to people which will influence their decisions in investing, right? So it is something we are talking today of a subject, not that it has come up in the last few years, but a role played even by the government. Today, more and more role played is by investors and stock exchanges. But you would see a lot of interesting work which happened and still there. The program still runs in Indonesia. Now, having done that bit of taking you from the DFIs and then an example of at the national level, let's look at the routes to safeguards in private sector financing. And similar that the World Bank and such bodies faced I would say, a very major resistance, criticism coming from the civil society. Here you see huge losses happening because people missed out the whole situation of environmental damage, site contamination, and liabilities. And some of the banks, in fact, went bankrupt because of those liabilities. And the whole collateral was getting understood differently. Uh, the private sector literally woke up that how could they be now more sensitive, more critical in their exposures, in the way they're taking, and also doing credit risk, assessment processes. And that led to a collective initiative in 1992, post the Earth Summit in Rio, and 215 institutions that included bank, insurers, fund managers. They signed up the UNEP's Sustainable Finance Initiative. We're talking, therefore, something 30 years ago. That was a collective initiative supported. Of course, UNEP took the lead and they came up with their guide to banking and sustainability. And today they run still a e-learning course on environmental and social risk assessment. But I think sequel to that, what you see is an initiative taken by many many commercial banks who came together, who were doing project financing, and they set out equator principles. And it went through various versions. Current version, what we see is Equator Principles 4, which was released in October 2020. And there are currently 140 EPFIs, that is Equator Principle Financing Institutions, across 39 countries who are operating their project financing through Equator Principles. And if you look at these Equator Principles, their applicability is not just on the project finance, where there have been some thresholds. They also have a role in project finance related advisory services, project related corporate loans, bridge loans, project related refinance, and project related acquisition finance. And implementation requirement, when we talk about EP version 4, is asking for climate change risk assessment using TCFD framework, alternatives analysis, and quantification and reporting of GHG emissions. That's the example how the climate started entering as the Equator Principles 1, 2, 3, 4 matured and they started reflecting global issues. They started also reflecting materiality from these global issues. And that maturity levels, again, remember, is all giving us foundations of the whole concept, how it came later on, the term ESG. I always call this as a three-letter word, as E, S, and G. It's a pun. I've written some satires on these three-letter words. Maybe at one stage with Naman, maybe we will send those links. I think I shared with you already. Now, these 10 principles, sometimes I call them as a Ravan of ESG. Ravana, because of 10 heads, you have the same 10 number. Somehow the World Bank also came up with 10 safeguards. But if you look at these, there's a considerable telescoping between Equator Principles 1 to 10 and the bank safeguards. And if you look at these 10 principles and the core, gets reflected into later on what, as I said, IFC came up in 2012 with their 8 performance standards on environmental and social management. And that has got support from the World Bank EHS guidelines. If you put them to principles, how does one put them into practice? The practice part of it, you find both the guidance and the backup in terms of more granular description, how to handle translation of these principles into practice. You see these two complementary standards and the guidelines. IFC performance standards, just few word about that. There are 8 standards, and they cover not only the environmental management. And I said, if you remember earlier, I had said that ESG how-to part has a management system in mind, but occupational health and safety, labor welfare, land acquisition, community health and safety, what have you. And this is something applicable, these standards, and so much so today that when we talk about delivering the ESG frameworks, often the ask or the reference framework asked is the IFC performance standard. I was talking about the guidelines, the EHS guidelines, which came out from the World Bank Group. So we have general guidelines, which are sector agnostic, have 63 sector specific guidelines, which help when we get into ENS risk management in a particular sector. So this is something excellent in terms of giving you resources, standards, and guidance that how do we translate those principles. They could be either equator principles, they could be safeguards, that how could we bring them into practice. A kind of a timeline, if you look at it, therefore, beginning from 70s here, because the whole social responsible investing came in the concept way back in 70s. And then you'll see slowly maturity levels growing, expansion happening. And as you see more and more understanding of global issues into ENS risks and the safeguards coming in, whatever I talked earlier, EPs I talked about, and equator principles and so on and so forth, you would see a lot journey. And beyond 2020, there have been several more. And those particularly are happening in the climate canvas more and more. You'll find investment getting more and more climate sensitive. So today, almost all key financial intermediaries in India that have set up funds or taken lines of credit from the DFIs or MDBs, they all make use of such performance standards or the EHS guidelines. That's a picture we see. And the ask is to set up a ESG management system, that how do you therefore operationalize the principles, both on the safeguards, particularly for DFI driven investments, and on PS or performance standards by setting up a suitable ESG management system. Now let's take at this moment a look at where are we today in our governance. Many of these elements, what we talked about, or the principles, are certainly addressed today differently by Government of India through its policies. And again, delivery mechanisms coming through different line ministries, and the requirements of enforcement also again allotted to different institutions. national level, state level. Of course, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change is the ministry, if you were to see where ESG would be associated. Ministry of Rural Development comes again, but then we don't have really a very strong social impact assessment framework there. Ministry of Corporate Affairs is more speaking on the CSR compliances, Ministry of Labor, and now the last couple of years, a little earlier even, the force coming from the SEBI, which is part of the Ministry of Finance. Now, if you looked at this, everything is in place, no doubt, but we have multiple organizations. We have often a segmented or a siloed view. Each one has their boundaries. So obviously, when you have boundaries, you are always going to be in some way getting compromised through the ambiguities and the overlaps. There are going to be issues of monitoring, implementation, and enforcement. And against all this, of course, we have that problem of poor human resources in terms of the
Sorry to
technical.
interrupt, but there's one question again.
Yeah,
Someone
no, no.
wanted some clarification on what are these GHG emissions. They just wanted a little bit more
Yeah,
elaboration on that
yeah,
concept.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Sorry for that. So GHG is greenhouse gas emissions. We are talking about. It's an abbreviation that we use, and there are 6 greenhouse gases we talk about. Everything we try to speak in terms of equivalent carbon dioxide emissions. And when we say GHG emissions, it often implicitly means equivalent carbon dioxide emissions.
And
Right.
there are, while we are at answering questions, there have been a few questions about how ratings or proper data disclosures would reduce this propensity of greenwashing, or maybe,
Yeah.
so what are your views on those
Yeah.
things?
So I do have a couple of slides, Naman, to follow,
Fine,
which
fine.
exactly
Okay.
touch upon. I think I'm
Perfect.
I'm
Perfect.
I'm happy that I'm raising those questions which I myself had in making these transference, these overrates. We have few slides on that. We'll come there.
Perfect. Great, great, great.
Yeah. So that's the challenge. Now, what happens? Just this one illustration. This is a CAG report which came on how effective has been the environmental clearance, and more importantly, the post clearance monitoring. The reason I'm putting this slide, and this is looks like 2015, but that's the latest. So you can imagine that these audits don't happen regularly. This is the last published audit report. It does tell you that they have a lot of shortcomings. So that means we already, although we have very good, well placed policies and regulations and enforcement mechanisms, there is a gap. And that gap then means that somebody who is investing, and although the borrower or the investing company shows all the clearances on paper, the investor is still a bit wary, given that fact that many times these are not necessarily proving that the situation is all good. And there could be cracks and there could be claims, which in different ways, a later stage of having done the investment could come back and then hit the reputation risk or any other liabilities which an investor, believing that the compliance is truly 100% compliance, can fall in that trap. So this is one of the reasons I said as earlier, there has been a bit of a siloed approach. The whole apparatus of ESG, the investors decided to apply, again, as I said, basis of what was evolved 20 years ago over a period of time, is to have their own system, independent system that they could use to assess environment, social, and the governance. And interestingly, when that is done, the governance team is a bit different and the ENS team is different. Again, in ENS, you would see that there's an E team different and an S team different. But that's an operational issue. But nonetheless, you would now realize that if you were an investor and if you come to see such cracks in the enforcement happening, that means the proof of compliance is not necessarily the solace for the investor. You would then like to have your own system that you will apply. Again, as I said, basis of several years of work done on the safeguards and the equator principles and performance standards and so on and so forth. So if you don't do that, then what you see then, people going to special courts and there be, as you know, most of you know, there is a National Green Tribunal, which is to basically address the cases, complaints which people are making against whenever they see that there is a default, or there is a fault, or there is a issue of non-compliance causing environmental damage or adverse social impacts. Uh, the reason I'm flagging this, that this is another reason I would say that a ESG framework, if is established, I'm saying not just as a checkpoint to clear your investments, but a process being set in a form of a management system with the borrower, is one way you would do your best to insulate from such kinds of, although there is no 100% insulation going to be still, but you still have a mechanism actually to stay away from possibilities that you get pulled. I mean, your company is getting pulled to the National Green Tribunal. So, if you therefore look at the case of you investing in an existing business, then which is happening, lots of mergers and acquisition. ESDD is not a regulatory process. ESDD stands for environmental, social due diligence. We still don't have in the country a legal piece on site assessment. And then again, although the law is asking for an environmental management cell in the organization, that also often doesn't happen. So there is a need, therefore, you would see that an integrated instrument was being looked at by the investor community. And, as it happened, how the apple fell on Newton's head, the same thing happened, and people, oh, this is one ESG, which can be then made more granular, more stress, aggressively communicated, and make that into form of a ask that the borrower is setting up a required ESG framework, has a management system, and makes commitment and follows through this reporting as well as disclosures. Now, that is one part that we all understood how the need came up and how the evolution took place. But we are in that situation, remember today, that our governance is still today residue centric. We don't want waste to harm the environment. So we have solid waste management, hazardous waste management, you have plastic waste management and handling rules, biomedical waste. Much of our approach has been residue centric, but resource efficiency, resource sufficiency, which is different from efficiency, or the push towards circular economy, they don't still have a center stage. Similarly, we don't have a legislation on strategic environmental impact assessment, and we often do not look at cumulative impacts. And the climate change associated risks are not yet on the agenda as a part of the screening mechanism. And therefore, a lot of work ESG frameworks had to do, that they can't just wait till the national maturity happens on all these outstanding issues I talked about, but they had to then create their own system. And therefore, you do see a differential between an approach when an investor takes on ESG, and many of the borrowing institutions come to me and ask me, this is asking too much. Why so much is being asked? And this is because of all these challenges I talked about in this slide. So expanding envelopes is again an important part that, as I said, what is missing, but more importantly, now we see more and more life cycle thinking happening, more and more importance of not looking at the factory boundary alone, but supply chains, bringing in more strongly environmental social diligence in onboarding the suppliers, and the whole area of extended producer responsibility, which Government of India is pushing in many sectors, market regulations, especially on products. All of these, if you put together, we do not therefore want only a reactive strategy, but something proactive, and that's what you will find in the ESG frameworks. This slide I'm skipping just to give you an idea. The huge efforts happened in OECD, and they came up very interesting guidelines, not only for multinational enterprises, but for investment, a policy framework, and the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. In other words, multiple countries have collectively come up and started addressing the challenges, what I talked to you earlier, and there's a good material therefore available for any organization to take a guidance. Just like the map which I was showing you, a timeline of the safeguards and the principles of investing, the way it moved over the last 30, 40 years, you would see here a myriad of different ESG rating schemes. Not that one is better than another, but different approaches over the years and indices. Even if you look at the indices set up in Bombay Stock Exchange, like CarbonX or GreenX, they have also a CSR index and so on and so forth. Uh, but then you will see that over a period of last, I would say 20, 25 years, there have been a number of ESG rating schemes. And disclosure becomes so critical that, of course, that the ratings can only be given basis of information available. And I'm giving you two shots here, examples of one is of the Container Corporation of India Limited, which has scored very low out of 100, a score of 12. And if you examine the data availability element there for that organization was very low, and that suffered. Basically, the rating became much lower because information was simply not available. Whereas if you take an example of a company where the same sector, logistics, but made a lot of information available, the score was higher, much, much higher. Like in this case, 62, where data availability was very high. Now, this was an important point where I think somebody asked a question earlier, Naman, about data rating systems and so on and so forth. And the differences, again, within the rating systems has been one of the reasons that you would see many companies, same company, getting different ratings if you chose MSCI, for example, or Sustainalytics. This slide is busy. I'm not going to take you through this slide, but the point to make here is that the approaches can be different. The weights can be different. The sequence can be also different in terms of where to bring qualitative and quantitative information. So multiplicity of rating schemes, and again, it all depends therefore how comprehensive these rating schemes are and how they align with some of the international standards makes the situation different depending on the rating agency. This is another question gets asked that Dow Jones Sustainability Index is another one of the major global indices, and could that help to understand the sustainability performance of companies? Because that again makes use of various ESG criteria. And again, if you look at the major focus today in terms of DJSI, you would see that it covers literally very, very important elements of the life cycle, which includes carbon, water, products, diversity of the workforce, and people development programs. So all these would mean then you can be evaluated differently by different schemes and the lenses. Lot then depends, these rating schemes, on how you're reporting, how you're disclosing, and that landscape also is getting pretty complicated. And definitely, you would see some like GRI are very popularly used. Supply chains eco bodies is being used. You have in the climate space CDP and TCFD being used, and so on and so forth. And you would see one of the quadrants which I earlier talked about, MSCI or Sustainalytics, DJS, I also had talked about, they're also there. So, it's an entropy today to the person heading the ESG department. And which way do I go if ESG is so important to my investor community? So these questions are there. Which rating do I choose? Which one is really going to give me a true performance on my sustainability? And given the challenges on data, and data is a big challenge, validation is still a question, and then the risk of greenwashing in that particular situation. Um, so research is now showing, and Naman, this is, I'm sure maybe your group is already taken up this for Indian, investing space. The research is showing that absolute ESG rating may not be a great idea to use a decision point for investing, but the delta over a couple of years is more critical than today's number. And we need more and more evidence to such kinds of inferences, which have been mainly drawn from the European Union. And I think I'm sure they will be also valid in the Indian side. One thing is sure, however, that multiple indicators you use, rating schemes you use, the conclusion that ESG is helping in profits, or if not short term, certainly long term, I think there is not much disagreement there anymore. it is something which is good for the business if you used it correctly. Given that challenge that we found, there were multiple rating schemes. There is certainly, you see, attraction now more towards harmonization. The World Economic Forum has come with a set of indicators which probably are now influencing a lot, and we will see so more and more in the next years to come in the rating agencies. More and more in that process, you would see a double materiality assessment is playing a role. There is some caution here because it depends on your samples that you use from stakeholders, but a great promise for value add, that how can you use the results of materiality to focus your journey, whether you want to focus on water or energy or greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth. And if you did that, there is certainly going to be an improvement in the profitability because these are all material to company's business. Look at some examples. This is Dantos ESG ambition of 2030. And if you look at very simple punchlines, we want to pioneer solutions for customers to enable decarbonization. It's a very loaded statement. We innovate best-in-class circular products. We offer a leading employee experience that values and respects diversity and inclusion. So this is the way to go, that if you want to bring your efforts on ESG, not just in the form of rating, but also making your roadmaps like DHL here. You'll see very interesting statements: clean operations for climate protection, great company to work for all, and highly trusted company. And you would see under these visionary statements, which actually set the missions for the company, I think ESG is helping to set it up directionally in a way that while you address your materiality, you're also meeting your other objectives of building your brand, and you then get much more ability to be future ready. So you do see ESG based commitments being made, whether you use reporting formats or rating formats, they just guide you, and that helps you really to come up with something which you can be accountable for. Remember here, the most important point is the process of improving ESG performance is important. The process is not the rating. Process is the most important element. As I said earlier also, I think I sounded India is moving fast up the curve. Our commitments to 2017 net zero, decarbonization getting into business planning, climate risk in the appraisals of the projects, missions like hydrogen, circular economy, mission life, more and more emphasis on green investments, infrastructure. Bombay Stock Exchange long back has signed up for SSE, Sustainable Stock Exchange. There is a draft already made by the Ministry of Finance on sustainable taxonomy, and most of you know SEBI's recent directions on moving from BRR to BRSR. You also see assurance coming in now, and also guidance to ESG reporting rating providers in India, giving them a core set and a regulatory framework proposed for the ESG mutual funds. This is great, and this is the excellent timing to as much value addition can one do. So just the last two slides, Naman. One, let's look at what's next now. What's important that we should now go beyond at a national level, beyond GDP to measure welfare. That's where you'll find ESG. And ESG not is only for business organizations. Oh, well, we have ESG is also being talked about even by the municipalities or cities elsewhere. But more importantly, we also want to understand how do we assess the impact of ESG or ESG impact assessment, and impact standards need to be developed, and they need to be integrated in the development effectiveness. So reporting standards will definitely now shift more and more to impact. You already see those footsteps, but more and more. Stakeholders definitely would want to have a better understand the organizations, how are they measuring and improving their impact? And more that understanding will reduce the situations of greenwashing and the increasing supply chain transparency by utilizing as much direct data as possible. And this is, I will call in many ways, a digitalization which is happening in our business processes and relationships. That's what is going to be a very good opportunity when it comes to impacts. Let me give you this example of 2022, the Security Exchange of Thailand launched its first ESG impact assessment. And this report is available for your downloading. And E and S and G part, you will see on the left of this slide, and the numbers on the right. This is what we should see in India. This is what we should see as we are bringing in the element of ESG. As I said, differently by different ministries, different mechanisms, different asks, a lot of role played by, as I said, DFIs, PFSIs, all of them pushing the agenda. But I think this is what we would like to see, the outcome. What difference has it made by ESG at the national level? Well, many investors do it at the portfolio level. Here is a very interesting case of a country like Thailand, who came up with their ESG impact assessment report. So to sum up, I mean, there are many takeaways I would have liked to go about and revisit. But I think we do need a common code by the IFIs first. By IFI, I mean the International Financing Institution, getting it more and more granular when we talk about category FI. Role of central banks is important here for a uniform environmental social risk management. Bangladesh is one example. The BBA, Bangladesh Bankers Association, has a common ESRM used by all banks in Bangladesh. We were involved assisting Bangladesh. Currently, we just supported Nepal, where we worked with 16 commercial banks to set up a common agenda on sustainable finance. And we are also working with 36 such banks in Egypt at the moment with the central bank. But lot and lot activity has to be seen now from the RBI. I would say SEBI, from the Ministry of Finance in India, is definitely playing a role, but not just now asking for a uniform ESRM, although reporting has become standard, the BRSR, for example. We do need more and more case studies. You see, the understanding the importance of value creation through ESG is most critical. And that's where, Naman, I will urge centers like you should really publish number of such case studies where ESG was a big value add and not just limited to risk management. So let us make ESG as a compelling case. And ESG should be a default business strategy for every organization to be future ready. Let's not keep it separate. It should be a part of the thought process of the leaders. And the leadership, when they plan business, ESG should be a part, integral part of that strategy. We did a report last year, which is published, is available on the website. It's an India ESG Pulse Check. And it is based on desk research and expert dialogues. And we have these names, and the reason I put these names is we really were fortunate to have people from funds, large corporates. We had people who came up with earlier a lot of good work on the rating schemes, development sectors. We had a Bloomberg expert joining in. A lot of interesting. I mean, this composition itself was very exciting. This year we'll publish at the end of the year a second version of the ESG Pulse Check, and I'll be most pleased, Naman, to be in partnership with your center, that let's work together and give an update to what we did in 2022. So I'm stopping at this point. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm sure there'll be questions, Naman. So please.
There are most of the questions are related to the availability of data and also the wide and the validity of the data being available, like how to discern between a genuine ESG effort and a greenwashing effort, right? So is there data which is available out there, or what are the type of data that you employ to evaluate or help out organizations? Those are the primary questions. Yeah.
Right. Data is obviously the most burning issue. It's not just the data, like you said, even how valid is that data. So data validation will happen more and more. As you know, SEBI is urging for moving to the next stage of assurance to the BRSR. So I think what we would see, I think we did see in the first BRR versions, this year's BRSR versions, a data flow which is voluntarily disclosed by the organization, not gone formally through the assurance process. As you all know, next year we will be having a assurance process, and that number will expand from 250 to back again to the full 1,000 after a couple of years by 2025. So yes, this is the transition that we are all facing related to data, but I think over a period of time, we will, through the assurance requirements, at least that will help in minimizing the greenwash part of it.
Another question is about the monitoring and policy implementation challenges, because we have seen that it has been difficult to come up with a standardized format and things like that. So, any insights on those issues?
I would say very strongly capacity building. I think we really need a lot of capacity building in this subject when it comes to delivery. Even from the point of view of regulators, we do need a lot for them to appreciate such mechanisms, apart from just mere implementation of the legislation. There, I think centers like yourselves have a great role to play, and probably we need many such centers across the country who will collaborate and offer programs, training programs, and they could be virtual, but I think more and more understanding of this subject in the true sense, and not like a checkbox. I think that's the missing situation at the moment. It's looked at as just do I have all the documents which somebody's going to ask me, and let me look at that. Not how to get a value out of it, and that's where I would say case studies will play a role.
And also, there has to be some differences in terms of different sectors, right? What is ESG for let's say a manufacturing company might be a little bit different compared to someone else. So is it possible to have a uniform framework, or would it be advisable to have different frameworks depending on different sectors and so on?
So, Naman, I don't imagine that there will be one single global standard, but the
Hmm.
principles. So that I will put it this way: that there will be a few things which are non-compromising principles, which we call them as a guiding principles, which support the policy statement. But then we have operational principles, which are below the guiding principles, which are pretty focusing on the type of business and the sector we are operating. So a particular guiding principle into my business context, I will come up with an operational principle that it will be linked to that particular guiding principle. Years ago, I set up such a system for a group called ILFS Limited, and they had 11 major verticals, which took about 88% of their entire revenue stream. And for those 11, we set up operational principles, and the corporate had the guiding principles, which were not to be compromised. So this is a kind of a hybrid structure that we always will follow, where you have something core, non-compromisable, and something directional, which are relevant from the operational sense.
One last devil's advocate question now. So it's like, someone says, what does this is Goldie Adman? He says, what does the recent decline in ESG investment inflows in major economies mean for the future of sustainable investing? Yeah.
Yeah. So the numbers can be how do I put? Sometimes the statistics is very funny in a sense. If the number declines, on the uptake of these investments, which are tightly rimmed by the ESG, then to have that investment flow and unleash money, which is parked somewhere else, you then not dilute, I would say, but go away from the ESG focused investments, because even that investor, there is answerable to disbursements, and if I cannot push them fast because of so-called fencing happening because of ESG, then I may look somewhere else. And this is the differential approach, I think, in the economy always happening.
Okay. So, Mohan, Anish, any final questions from your side?
Yeah, thanks, Naman. Thank you very much, Dr. Modak. I'm especially like not thought about the evolution part where we have these equator principles and so what is interesting is that despite the fact that banks have been using some form of ESG assessment for a long period of time. I think banks are one of the uh, sectors that really currently are behind in terms of ESG. If you look at generally across sectors, why do you think that is the case? Because they are familiar with this. I know when I was working in consulting, ICS, we have done a policy for ESG. No, it was not called ESG at that time, Environmental and Social Assessment for ICICI Bank. That was early 2000s or late 90s. But they haven't seemed to picked up on that and built those assessments into the contemporary debates around ESG.
I would put it more, it's something like this, that and I think that is the attitude, that people look at the requirements coming from E, S, and G. The G part is different, as I said,
Yeah,
is always
correct,
corporate
yeah.
governance, but
Right.
merely on compliance or a risk aversion mechanism, but they don't look at it as a value add. And this has been really a challenge. I'll give you an example that when this is a road project in Gujarat, which was between Vadodara and Halol. And when this went through an environmental and social impact assessment, the financer could develop that project in such a way which reduced the resettlement tremendously. It allowed for the animals to cross from one side to another. There were cattle underpasses first time created in the country. And those expenditures were about 1.5% of the project cost. As against, the project got delivered and implemented 8 months before, and then you could get your revenue stream from tolling. And that was much more critical in terms of that 1.5% expenditure. In other words, we have to look at the business point of view, that how this investment is going to give you returns. And there are many examples, Mohan, where it has worked. And obviously, because it has worked, it is getting some traction. The psyche on most of the part of the companies in India still are looking at this as imposition, but they're not able to see the upside through innovation. And I think if you bring that element of innovation while responding to ESG, then you have a huge opportunity for value creation. We have seen that the entry and exit of an investor, equity investor, if ESG is rightfully used, there is a tremendous multiplier advantage that they can increase the value of the company. So I think that is the attitude we should see more and more in our investor community.
Thank you. So Anand, sorry, one of our own RAs has a question. Devashish, can you put her? She's just joined the center and she wanted to get some insights. So Yashodhara, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah,
Am
Yashodhara.
I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So my question was about like the challenges which are related to the monitoring and implementation of policies when it comes to whether it be environment related or social related or governance related. Many people say that firstly the data it is not clean enough, that the data hygiene is not very good, or the data reliability data cannot be trusted. And secondly, they also say when it comes to any problem, whether be it of social nature or environmental nature, a localized point of view is not there. They say that like that empathy to have for the marginalized people or certain environment problems, for example, illegal timber logging. So that localized point of view is missing. That grassroots level development perspective is missing amongst people. Do you like? Can you explain a little bit more?
No, I think what you had done, Yashodhara, is you have stated the problems, and that is correct. Your assessment is right. That this is the challenge there's a disconnect between what is happening in the field. I think the second point, that how are you handling the local situations, from the point of view of being compliant to the required expectations from the laws and regulations. So there is, Ishwadhara, a challenge right now of that disconnect. Now, the solution, while one could say that, improve, let's say, enforcement of the legislation, uh, or do more and more field level assessment of the claims made. There is a still, I would say, a challenge in terms of people understanding why are we going ahead with such kinds of requirements of meeting the standards of legislation. I think there is not just the data disconnect, but there is also a thought disconnect that people are they're still not able to understand why such kinds of requirements are to be met. So there's a huge work to be done, certainly. But to my surprise, whenever I have done such field assessments, Yashodhara, that I have found that people who are there in the region, in that local location, are far more understanding the environmental and social issues. What they don't have is many times how do they voice their mechanisms and how do they bring in the enforcement protection of their interests. If you look at, therefore, the whole genesis of the National Green Tribunal was, I think, to respond to those complaints. Now, I would say India's performance on environmental and social management, if you said number of cases filed in NGT over the last 5 years. In fact, we made a heat map of the complaints gone to NGT, why people complain, and which regions do you see complaints happening. The picture was very clear. It aligns to what you just said. So the solution is not through a green tribunal. The complaint by itself should not go. So one of the elements in ESG is that you must have a stakeholder engagement plan. You must have a grievance redress mechanism. The question is that although I get to see there is a grievance redress plan made as a tick check box in the ESG, how functional is the GRM? That's an issue. One topic we didn't touch in today's presentation, that there is a term we use called accountability and accountability mechanism. And that's something which financing institutions have set up already. And that is also revealing that we are not taking the grievance part seriously in terms of a functional GRM. So answer to your question, Ashwadhara, is your problem statement is correct, but the solutions are pretty complex and they will depend a lot on not just the efforts at the field level, but also the mindset and people's understanding. I'm saying both sides, those who are developing projects in these areas and those who are facilitating the project implementation. So that's the challenge.
Thank you
I
so
mean,
much.
we can connect bilaterally later on, definitely, because you are working in the center itself, right, during your research. So I'll be happy to talk to you later separately.
So thank you very much. So last question of the day, and we'll reserve it for Professor Anish Sugatan, who is the co-chair of the center. So Anish, please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you so much, Naman and Professor Modak. This was fabulous. The way you covered the entire landscape, both temporally as well as spatially. That was fabulous. I'm sure a lot of the participants benefited. I'm going to sort of take a slightly devil's advocate position question here, which is partly motivated by the politicization of ESG, which we have seen coming up, let's say in the US context, most sharply, the divide between Republican and Democratic positions. Now, I'm sort of thinking both in terms of the roots of such a thing. We all know that practitioners know very well that ESG is as an end in itself is not the goal. At the end of the day, you're talking about good life for people, and there is not all ESG solutions are win-win solutions. Like you made an example of there are many cases where it's a zero-sum game, and ILO, for example, highlights justice in transition, the job losses which are inherent in transition. The moment you take away coal, you know what's going to happen in terms of the livelihoods. Even the potential for upskilling is extremely difficult for the kind of labor force that we're talking about. It's once, and if we are tone deaf in a evangelist mode, being tone deaf to these shortcomings, these core challenges, I think ESG would become an enemy of itself. What do you think? How is it? How do we sort of make sure that the conversation doesn't look all evangelizing? Rather, take a pragmatic approach so that the practitioners don't feel this is greenwashing. Because the moment something takes a evangelist tone, everyone feels this is too good to be true, right? What is your views on this fact?
In my experience, Professor, whenever I have started my ESG dialogue at the board level and then sitting in the room of the CFO, that works far better than I start my journey with the CSO. And it is so crucial that the buy-in of this concept to be taken at the board level and by the chief financial officer when he understands the materiality as a core, and the buying in happens there. Then the icing on the cake is when I move to the CSO, and then I understand the other expectations. But whenever done this way, my experience has been that it becomes a very practical business strategy. When I say business here, again, I can say inclusive business strategy if I want to be socially oriented. I can say sound business strategy if I want to bring in governance. And I can using that kind of a approach to permeate in the organization should be the strategy. And many times I find that if you make that mistake of engaging first with the CSO, it doesn't give you the grip on what organization wants to do in the future. So let us look at ESG as not a silver bullet solution. I think that's very important to understand that this is a process that will trigger conversations. We encourage engagements and discussions with stakeholders. It's like what we have in the subject of life cycle assessment. It's not a product level life cycle assessment. We call OLC, the organizational level life cycle assessment, which is a very, very interesting tool to come about and to innovate. How do we bring in the ESG elements? So my answer to your question will be that this ESG has to be played correctly. If not done, it runs into these challenges that, is it a greenwash or is it something which is just talked about but not actually implemented? So the job of anybody who is advising an organization on ESG will have to be, therefore, is very sensitive role that how do you hit the right points in that organization. Once you have that buying in, then you find that you do then something and achieve something, which also then is a typical evangelist would like to look at. So I think my experience is that we are going through that transition. See, everything which is coming up has to go over a transition phase where there is some turbulence and there is some few things which are not so satisfactory. But the point I was trying to make in the beginning that don't look at this as a new concept at all. We have a 40 years history. And ESG professionals, I see them today in the market, do not know this history. They are overnight ESG practitioners if you're very good in Microsoft Excel. That's not what ESG is about. And this is sometimes a concern to the younger generation, that they do not have the patience, not access to people who have worked 30, 40 years in this field and bring in that element which is often missing. When I talk to people, half of them or more than them even do not know what happened in Indonesia in 1995. Right? It was a very interesting ESG experiment. It brought disclosures. It encouraged companies to perform and compete between each other. This is 30 years ago. Not that I'm saying that go in the past all the time, but when you go in the past, you innovate when you come to the present and look at the future. So
The
my
proper
my
experiment.
my request to your center is to just meet that part, bridge that gap. And you have a great role. I think, Arun, this is, I think, the reason why you set up this center. You remember we spoke maybe 3 years ago, and you told me about your vision. I think you have a huge role to play, given the challenge which just now what Professor Anish talked about.
Thank you, Prasad. I think, first of all, this was a fantastic journey of historical proportion that you took us through. And I must admit, even I was getting a little hazy about how did it all start. So as Anish mentioned, there is a debate, there's a controversy, which is a good thing. I think we'll all come out better. We'll all come out implementing it in a manner that that is more effective and aligned to the long-term well-being and growth of companies and investors' portfolios.
Thank you, Arun.
I think with those last comments from Mr. Duggal, this is an opportune time to close the webinar. I would like to thank all the attendees and, of course, Dr. Modak for giving this interesting talk. So thank you very much. And for the attendees, we look forward to seeing you in our future webinars. So thank you.